Picture this. It's 1609. An elderly black man, a former slave, sits across from Spanish colonial officials. He's not begging for freedom. He's negotiating terms. Behind him stands an entire community of formerly enslaved Africans who have defended their freedom for nearly 40 years. The Spanish Empire, one of the most powerful forces on earth, is about to do something unprecedented. Officially recognize a settlement of escaped slaves as legally free. This happened 256 years before the abolition of slavery in the United States. This is the story of Gaspar Yanga, the African prince who defeated Spain and built America's first free black town. And it's a story that the colonial powers tried desperately to erase. We're taught that freedom for enslaved Africans in the Americas came through emancipation, through the goodwill of governments and the progress of civilization. We're told that enslaved people waited, suffered, and were eventually granted their liberty. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? What if enslaved Africans didn't just wait for freedom? They took it, defended it, and forced the most powerful empire in the world to recognize it legally? This is the story of Gaspar Yanga, an African prince who became a slave, escaped bondage, and did the impossible. He built a free black settlement in the heart of Spanish colonial territory and forced Spain to acknowledge it through a formal treaty. He didn't wait for abolition. He didn't ask for permission. He fought, negotiated, and won. And in doing so, he created something that would stand as a beacon of resistance for centuries to come. To understand the magnitude of what Yanga achieved, we need to understand the world he was fighting against. It's the 1570s in New Spain, what we know today as Mexico. The Spanish colonial empire is at its height, extracting unimaginable wealth from the Americas through a brutal system of exploitation. Silver mines, sugar plantations, and cattle ranches, all powered by enslaved labor. And here's something that often gets overlooked. The scale of slavery in Latin America dwarfed that of North America. While approximately 400,000 enslaved Africans were brought to what would become the United States, over 4 million were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean. In Mexico alone, the enslaved African population was substantial, concentrated particularly in the coastal regions and sugar-producing areas like Veracruz. The conditions were horrific. Sugar cultivation was backbreaking, deadly work. Enslaved people were worked to death and simply replaced. The Spanish colonial system was designed to extract maximum profit with complete disregard for human life. Escape seemed impossible. The colonial authorities had weapons, horses, tracking dogs, and the full force of law on their side. But here's what the Spanish didn't count on: the African tradition of resistance. Throughout the Americas, wherever there was slavery, there were Maroons, escaped slaves who formed independent communities in remote areas. In Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, Colombia, everywhere enslaved Africans were brought. Some escaped and built free settlements. The Spanish called these communities palanques. The Portuguese called them quilombos. But whatever the name, the principle was the same: freedom, taken by force and defended at all costs. Enter Gaspar Yanga. Historical records suggest he was born around 1545 in the region that is now Gabon, in West Africa. But he wasn't just anyone. Yanga claimed to be of royal descent, a member of the ruling class of his people. Imagine the psychological journey, from royalty to chattel, from a prince to property. The humiliation, the rage, the burning desire for freedom must have been overwhelming. Around 1570, Yanga made his move. He escaped from the sugar plantations near Veracruz and fled into the highlands of the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains. But Yanga didn't run alone, and he didn't hide. He began gathering other escaped slaves, building a community, creating a settlement. This wasn't just survival. This was nation-building. The location was strategic. The highlands of Veracruz were rugged, difficult to access, with dense vegetation and treacherous terrain. Perfect for defense, terrible for anyone trying to attack. Yanga knew that to survive, his people needed more than just a hiding place. They needed a sustainable community. They cultivated crops, raised livestock, established governance structures. They created what Yanga called San Lorenzo de los Negros, a self-sufficient Maroon settlement. But here's the shocking part. They didn't just hide. They raided. When supplies ran low, Yanga's people would descend from the mountains and raid Spanish plantations and trading routes. They would take food, weapons, tools, whatever they needed. And critically, they would liberate more enslaved people, bringing them back to the settlement. Each raid was both an act of survival and an act of war. For more than 30 years, this continued. Think about that. While Spain controlled virtually everything around them, while the Spanish Empire stretched across the globe, this community of formerly enslaved Africans lived free. They married, had children, built homes, governed themselves. They did what the Spanish said was impossible. The Spanish authorities weren't idle. They sent military expeditions to crush the settlement. Multiple times, and every single time they failed. Yanga and his people knew the terrain. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, strategic retreats. They fought not like a conventional army, but like people who had everything to lose, because they did. They were fighting for their freedom, their families, their very lives. And Yanga wasn't just a fighter. He was a diplomat and strategist. Historical accounts suggest he formed alliances with indigenous communities who had their own reasons to resist Spanish authority. This coalition of the oppressed created a network of resistance that the Spanish simply couldn't break. By 1609, the Spanish had had enough. For nearly 40 years, this Maroon settlement had been a thorn in their side, an embarrassment, a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for every enslaved person in the region. The colonial authorities decided to end it once and for all. They assembled a serious military force, well-armed, well-trained Spanish soldiers, along with indigenous auxiliaries and armed colonists. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a full military expedition designed to destroy the settlement completely. The commander was Pedro González de Herrera, a veteran colonial military leader. His orders were clear: eliminate the Maroon community. But here's where Yanga's genius truly shines. By this time, he was elderly, somewhere in his 60s, ancient by the standards of the time, especially for someone who had lived the life he'd lived. But age had brought wisdom. He knew his people couldn't match the Spanish in conventional warfare. So he didn't try. Instead, Yanga employed classic guerrilla tactics. When the Spanish advanced, the Maroons retreated into the mountains. When the Spanish tried to establish positions, they faced ambushes. When the Spanish pursued, they found the terrain working against them. Narrow passes, dense forests, rocky highlands where their horses were useless, and their formations broke apart. The Spanish forces were frustrated, exhausted, and failing. They were suffering casualties, running low on supplies, and no closer to destroying the settlement than when they started. The Maroons, meanwhile, were in their element, fighting on their terms, on their land. And Yanga, this elderly African prince turned rebel leader, was orchestrating the entire defense. Then Yanga did something extraordinary. He sent a message to the Spanish commander. Not a surrender, a negotiation. He proposed terms. His people would stop raiding Spanish settlements in exchange for official recognition of their freedom and their right to their land. He was offering peace, but as equals, not as defeated rebels begging for mercy. Think about the audacity of that moment. An escaped slave, negotiating with the Spanish Empire, not asking for freedom as a gift, demanding recognition of a freedom already taken and defended. This was unprecedented. This wasn't supposed to be possible. But the Spanish were in a bind. They couldn't defeat Yanga militarily. They'd tried and failed repeatedly. Every day the campaign continued cost them money, resources, and lives. And meanwhile, the existence of this free black settlement was inspiring slave rebellions throughout the region. The Spanish needed this resolved, so they agreed. In 1609, Spain officially recognized Yanga's settlement as a free town. They signed a treaty, a legal document acknowledging the freedom of formerly enslaved Africans and their right to self-governance. The town was officially named San Lorenzo de los Negros, though it would later be renamed Yanga in honor of its founder. The terms of the treaty were remarkable. The Maroons were granted legal freedom, not manumission as individuals, but collective recognition as a free community. They were given land rights. They were allowed to govern themselves with their own elected officials. There were some conditions. They agreed not to harbor newly escaped slaves, to return any who came to them, a provision largely ignored, and to defend the area against foreign invasion. But these were terms negotiated between parties, not conditions imposed on the defeated. This was the first legally recognized free black settlement in the Americas. Not just a Maroon community surviving in hiding. An officially recognized free town with legal protections under Spanish colonial law. Let that sink in. In 1609, while slavery was expanding throughout the Americas, while the transatlantic slave trade was at its height, while European colonial powers were building entire economies on enslaved African labor, a community of black people forced the Spanish Empire to recognize their freedom legally. Now here's what makes this story even more incredible. This happened 234 years before Britain abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833. It happened 256 years before the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States in 1865. More than 2.5 centuries before abolition, enslaved Africans in Mexico had already won their freedom and forced a European colonial power to recognize it. So why don't we know this story? Why isn't Gaspar Yanga a household name? Why isn't the town of Yanga celebrated as a crucial site in the history of black liberation? The answer is uncomfortable but simple, because this story was dangerous. It proved something that every slave society in the Americas desperately needed to deny, that enslaved people could win their own freedom, that they didn't need to wait for the kindness of their enslavers, that they could organize, fight, and force recognition of their humanity and their rights. For every colonial power, for every slave owner, this was a nightmare scenario. If enslaved people in Virginia or Jamaica or Brazil learned that formerly enslaved Africans in Mexico had defeated the Spanish Empire and won legal recognition of their freedom, what might they attempt? The story of Yanga was a match that could light fires of rebellion across the entire slave-holding world. So the story was suppressed, minimized, erased from the dominant historical narratives. History books focused on abolition movements led by white activists, on gradual emancipation, on slavery ending through legal processes and moral progress, not on enslaved people liberating themselves through force of arms and strategic resistance. But the truth has a way of surviving. The town survived. The memory survived. And now, finally, the story is being told. Today, the town of Yanga still exists in the state of Veracruz, Mexico. It's a living monument to resistance, a testament to what Gaspar Yanga and his people achieved more than 4 centuries ago. In Mexico, Yanga is recognized as a national hero. There are statues, commemorations, celebrations of his legacy. But the significance goes far beyond one town, one man, or even one nation. Yanga proved that black liberation didn't begin with emancipation proclamations or abolition acts. It began the moment the first enslaved African decided they would be free and acted on that decision. It continued through every act of resistance, every escaped slave, every Maroon community throughout the Americas. Yanga's settlement was the first to win legal recognition, but it wasn't the only one. His success inspired others. Throughout the colonial period, Maroon communities existed across Latin America and the Caribbean, some temporary, some lasting for generations. In Jamaica, the Maroons forced the British to sign peace treaties. In Suriname, Maroon communities still exist today, descendants of people who escaped slavery and never went back. In Brazil, the Quilombo of Palmares held out for nearly a century. The lesson of Gaspar Yanga is this: liberation doesn't wait for permission. Freedom isn't granted, it's taken, defended, and secured. The formerly enslaved people of San Lorenzo de los Negros didn't wait for Spain to have a change of heart. They didn't wait for abolition. They freed themselves, built a community, defended it for 40 years, and forced the most powerful empire in the world to recognize what they had already claimed. That's the real history of black liberation in the Americas, not passive suffering waiting for rescue, but active resistance, strategic brilliance, military capability, diplomatic skill, and unbreakable determination. Gaspar Yanga embodied all of these qualities. An African prince who never forgot who he was, who never accepted his enslavement as legitimate, who built something lasting from the ashes of bondage. This is the history they didn't teach you in school. These are the stories that got erased, suppressed, or minimized because they were too dangerous, too empowering, too revolutionary. But they're the stories we need to know. The stories that show the full scope of black resistance, resilience, and achievement. If you want more hidden black history, the stories of resistance, achievement, and brilliance that changed the world, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment below. Who else should we cover? What other hidden figures and forgotten histories need to be brought into the light? Let's build this library of truth together. Remember, Gaspar Yanga didn't wait for freedom. He took it. He defended it. He won it. And more than 400 years later, his town still stands. Proof that when people decide they will be free, no empire is strong enough to stop them.